What's up, guys? Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So in today's video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to get started with the new rendering inside of SketchUp. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, so if you want to follow along, you can download this model from the 3D Warehouse. It's the Modern Cafe #1 from SCG Official. And so you can just download that and bring it in. I don't think I've made any modifications to it. We'll just fix any issues we have as we go. And so as a lot of you know, and I'm going to turn my axes off right here. As a lot of you know, SketchUp 2025 added the ability to create 3D renderings directly out of SketchUp. And so what I want to do is teach you how that works. So to start off, the place that you can access that, or the easiest place that you can access that, is actually going to be going up to your top toolbar, going into your Styles section, and clicking the box for Display Photoreal Materials. If your Styles window doesn't show up, you can right-click in the toolbar and toggle Styles on. But when you click on this, you're going to get a little pop-up right here just letting you know that this is activating the photoreal materials. And so you can check the box for don't show this again if you don't need it anymore, but I'm going to click on OK, and notice how the way this looks is now different. And the reason for that is actually twofold. So first off, if you look around your model, notice what this has done is this has applied a three-dimensional environment around the outside of your model. Specifically, it's using a file called an HRDI, which is basically a file that has light, or an image that has light information associated with it. So this is an image that was taken that also has information about the way that a scene is lighting things. And you can see more about that by going over into the environments section of your tray. Now, if you're on a Mac, I think it's probably just you do a window and then open up environments. And so notice how you can see different things about the environment when we pop this up. So first off, notice how you have options for a number of different environments built into SketchUp. And if you click between them, notice what's going to happen is the lighting in your model changes. That's because all of these pictures were taken at different times of day with different light information associated with them. So they're all going to look a little bit different. Now, we can adjust these once we pick them in the Edit section or the Edit tab right here. So when I click on Edit, notice how there's options in here to set things like the rotation angle. That's going to rotate that image around 360 degrees around your model right here. You've also got options for doing things like bringing up the exposure of that sky dome. So a lot of the time, and let's go ahead and let's pick this one, or this one right here. So I think this is the default one. So notice how when you look at this, it actually looks kind of like dark and washed out, and it makes your image kind of look this kind of like bluish, purplish color. So part of the reason for that is because the exposure on your sky dome is really low. But if you drag this to the right, notice how the exposure on your sky dome gets a lot higher right here. So you can adjust both the exposure on the sky dome, and you can also adjust the exposure on the reflections, which notice what that's going to do is that's going to adjust the brightness of the light that's being reflected in the three-dimensional space right here. So you're going to want to play around with that a little bit. So you don't want everything to look too bright, but you also don't want it to look super dark like this, which is how a lot of those initially come in. So you're going to be playing around with these settings a lot in order to get your lighting where you want it to be. Now, one thing to note about this is notice how there's a checkbox in here for set sun location. So let's uncheck that for a second, and let's go down and toggle our shadows on. So when we toggle our shadows on, notice SketchUp is going to apply shadows the way it always has, right? It's putting the shadows in here based on the time of day that you set and the time of year that you set. But the problem is when you're dealing with this HDRI image, that's not necessarily the way the shadows would actually look, because the shadows are going to be set based on the brightest point in the sky. Well, if you check the box for set sun location, notice how the little slider under shadows goes to gray and you can't adjust it anymore. That's because now the shadows in your scene are being set by the brightest point in this HDRI image right here. And you can actually see where that is by looking at the little image over here like this. So now notice how if I rotate this, the shadows are actually going to adjust along with this. And it can take a little while for that to load. So when you make those changes, right, notice how it takes a second to think before it shows those shadows in here. But basically now you're using the brightest point of your HDRI image in order to adjust your shadows. Now, one thing to be aware of with this is when you look at different environments, they cast different shadows. So notice how this one, it has a lower sun location. And so with that lower sun location, we're going to go ahead and check this box right here. But with that lower sun location, the shadows are going to have a different angle than they did previously. Say I adjust this kind of like this right here. Notice how it's driving different shadows than the other HDRI image that we had previously. Now, one thing you can do in here that's kind of fun is say that you want those shadows to be pointed down a little bit. You can cheat a little bit. And so the way that you can cheat is you can come in here and you can actually adjust your sun location up a little bit. So what we've done is we've basically said, okay, I understand that the sun, the brightest point is right here, but for my model, I want these to be a little further down. So we're going to kind of take this and we're going to move it up a little bit in the sky. And notice how when you do that, these shadows are cast in a different way. So you do have a little bit of flexibility in here on how you can move that around inside of your scene. Now, one other thing I want you to be aware of in here, well, actually, there's a few things. So first off, I want you to know how to turn these off, because one thing you might have noticed is if you toggle back into your display shaded using textures, it actually keeps that environment sky dome in the background. That's fine if you want that toggled on. If you don't, you can either uncheck the box for use environment as sky dome, or you can just go back to select and you can go to in model and you can pick a blank environment right here. That'll also move you back to the default SketchUp background in here. So if you do want to go back, you definitely can. Okay, so the other option you're going to want to pay attention to is the use environment for reflections. And so notice how, and these aren't PBR materials, so it'll look different in a minute, but notice how you can adjust the brightness of the reflections in here as well. So you probably spend a fair amount of time, or at least a little bit of effort, kind of trying to level those out, because you don't want your sky dome to look way too bright and then your reflections to not look bright enough, but you don't want it to be so bright that everything's kind of glowing. So you're going to play around with that a little bit in order to get the results that you're looking for, but you're going to want to pay attention to those options. In a second, we're going to talk about how SketchUp now has PBR materials inside of it, and those are going to affect the way that this looks. Now, before we do that, I do want to tell you about a couple places you can go to download additional HDRI images and bring them in. Okay, so the absolute gold standard for bringing in HDRI images is going to be Polyhaven. So Polyhaven is a website that has a bunch of freely available assets, but specifically if you go to assets and HDRIs, there's a number of different HDRI files that you can download in here. And so there's a bunch of them in here. One thing you're going to want to pay attention to is if you have a pure sky. So if you go into skies over here and you click on pure sky, what that's going to be is that's literally just going to be a sky image with no ground or anything in the background. So those are going to be super valuable if you're just trying to add a sky to your background. We'll take a look at the others in a second, but also pay attention to these little preview spheres right here, because one of the things those preview spheres is going to show you is they're going to show you what kind of shadows an HDRI image is going to cast. So if you look at this, this one is going to cast very strong shadows. So if you want strong shadows, you could pick that. Now, if you have more of a misty day or something where the sun is kind of covered a little bit, notice how you're going to get a lot less shadows being cast, kind of like how shadows work in the real world. Now, you can download these files and bring them in by clicking on them. And notice how there's an option for EXR or HDR. We're going to leave this on HDR. And the other thing you might notice is there's options to download this in different resolutions. You want to pay attention to this because it's going to do two things. First, it's going to affect the size of the file. So, for example, if I go to a 16K, notice how that HDR file is going to be 262 megabytes. Now, it's going to be a higher resolution background, and it's also going to cast a little bit more realistic light, but you probably don't want to be bringing in a 262 megabyte file into your SketchUp model, because you bring a couple of those in there and your performance is just going to take a nosedive. So you might pick something kind of in the middle here, maybe like a 2K or a 4K, and you're just going to want to play around with those resolutions. But once we download this, so I'm just going to download this partly cloudy sky file, you can bring those into SketchUp. Note that Polyhaven is support driven, so if you do want to donate to help keep them going, you can definitely do that. You can download these and use them under a CCO license, so you can use them for your commercial projects, but they are kind of fan supported. And so if you want to import that as a custom environment, what you can do is click on the little plus button right here, and you can go find that file that you just downloaded and click on open. Well, notice how that's going to bring that in as a new HDRI file in your scene right here. And so depending on the resolution of the scene and other things, you're going to have to adjust them in order to get the result that you're looking for. I'm going to toggle my shadows back on just so I can kind of view that right here. But we're going to adjust this so the shadows are kind of showing up where we want them to be right here. But notice how I'm able to use those external files inside of SketchUp, and those are going to show up in your in model section right here. So a lot of the time you can get better results of those external files. Just make sure that they're not like super big files. Now, one thing to note about this is if you do have a bunch of those in here, your file size can get pretty large because it tries to store these inside of SketchUp. But if you do a file save, now it's got kind of this automatic purge unused that pops up. You can tell it to not ask again, but if you're using the rendering, I would usually leave it on. And so you're going to want to purge that so that HDRI images that you're not currently using aren't being saved in your model. Okay, so the other half of this PBR rendering actually has to do with the materials. So if you go into the materials section of your tray, notice how this is going to look a little bit different. So previously, this just basically allowed you to select these different materials. And then if you edited them, you didn't have any rendering based settings, right? You had all of these other settings, but not your rendering based settings. Well, in this case, notice how this looks a little bit different. I was hoping this would be the time that they took to make the Mac and PC versions look the same. They have not done that. So I can only show you the PC version because that's what I have. But basically now all of your materials are going to have slots for different maps. And so notice, for example, and I'm probably going to have to use TomTom's material replacer on this. So I'm going to drop a material in here, but notice how if I pick one of these materials like this wood veneer, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use that extension in order to swap that in. So I want to go to Tools, Material Replacer. We're going to replace that with this. But notice how these materials, if you go into the Edit section, have different maps in them. And those maps are going to affect things about that material. I'm going to go ahead and make this one a little bit smaller. So maybe like 12 inches. That looks a little bit better, but notice how there's all these different sliders in here. Well, those sliders are going to affect how that object is going to look in the 3D space. And I can probably do a separate video on PBR maps and PBR in general, but basically what these things do is they use image maps in order to tell SketchUp or your rendering engine where to reflect light. So then if you adjust the roughness, a higher roughness means things are going to reflect less, a lower roughness means things are going to reflect more. But then you've also got things in here like your normal map. So what your normal map is going to do is it's going to make things look bumpy. So I'm going to bring the roughness up, and I'm going to bring the normal up a little bit too. And notice how now this renders out as more of a bumpy material in here, like this. And so you can use the library materials in SketchUp, which have been updated with this. And let's go ahead and let's just create a quick surface in here so you can kind of see what this looks like on a few different materials. So we'll go ahead and we'll split this right here. I'm going to go ahead and toggle my shadows off while we're doing this, just so you can kind of see what the reflections do. But different materials are going to act different ways. So for example, a brick material, if I apply that to the surface right here, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to edit this, and we're going to bring the normal up, and the ambient occlusion as well is going to look very bumpy and not very reflective, where if you bring in like a tile material, so if I got a tile right here, we'll pick a dark tile. You can probably see a little bit better. We'll go with this one right here. So that dark tile, notice how that's going to be a lot more reflective because it's kind of a glossy surface in here. So you're going to be able to see light reflect off of a material like that in different ways. And so there are other materials like metals as well. So if we were to bring a metal in, that's going to have a metalness that's going to be set to, it really should be set to either 1 or 0. But basically, this is you telling us, okay, this material is metal, so treat it like metal. And the normals are going to make it look bumpier or not, so you can kind of make that adjustment right here. So that's going to be the first thing, is if you want realism, especially with like 3D warehouse models, you're going to want to replace these old materials with materials that have the PBR maps, or you can use this cool function that this has in here, which is the AI tool. Now you want to be a little bit careful with this one because it's, in my opinion, it's not 100% complete, but like nothing AI is right now. So if we sample this though, and you click on the little button right here, that's going to automatically try to make textures seamless. And it's also going to try to generate those maps automatically as well. So if I click on this, notice what that's going to do is that's going to try to generate maps down below for this material. And when it does that, notice how that material looks a lot better. Like we can crank this roughness up right here. We can crank the normal up in order to make this look bumpy. And then what ambient occlusion does is it highlights the darks of something. So that map is going to highlight the darks. But again, notice how that material looks significantly better inside of our 3D space like this. Now, you can also download and create your own materials. And so again, Polyhaven is a great place to go for things like that. Another great website is 3dassets.one. So 3dassets.one actually searches multiple different websites for different textures and materials you can bring in, but I'm going to go to Polyhaven. So if you go to Polyhaven's textures section, you can download textures. And so there's a number of different textures in here. I'm going to pick a floor material. So we're going to pick this concrete floor 02 because it looks like it's got some good bumpiness in here. And again, note that you can pick different resolutions in here. The high resolution files are going to be very heavy. So you're probably going to want to stick between 2K and 4K. You can also select the option for zip rather than blend because you don't want to download this as a blend file. And so these are the different maps that you can bring in. And in this case, I'm going to pick just the ones that I want. So I don't want the blend file or the GLTF. I do want probably the normal map right here. We want the roughness map. I usually download these all as JPEGs. You can pick whatever you want. It's probably not that big of a deal. But if there's a metalness map, you can also bring that in, but we're going to pick all of these and we're going to download these, and it's going to download as a zip file. And so we can take this, right click on it and extract it. And notice how that's going to give you a folder that has the textures in it, and you can kind of preview these. And so notice how this has a metalness map. It has a diffuse map. So the diffuse map, this is the ambient occlusion actually. The diffuse map is just going to be the image that's repeated over and over again. That's just going to be your image for your texture itself. But then you've also got a normal map, which is what you load in to make things look bumpy. You're going to have a roughness map, which is going to set where things are going to reflect. And you're going to have an ambient occlusion map, which is going to be those kind of like darker highlights. But now if we want to create our own material in SketchUp, what we can do is we can just go to select. Right here, we're just going to click on the plus button, and we're going to bring in those different maps. So we'll pick a texture image, and that'll be the diffuse map. And then we're going to scroll down, and we'll load. And this one's not metal, so we don't need the metalness map, but we're going to load the roughness map. We're going to load the normal map, and we're going to load the ambient occlusion map right here for this concrete material. And so notice how I've created that material. And I can place it on this surface right here, and we can take a look at it. And so in this case, you're going to want to make some adjustments. So depending on how bumpy you want this to be, you can bring that roughness up, or the normal up. The roughness, you can set either a low roughness if you want this to reflect a lot, or a high roughness if you want it to be kind of like matte. And then you can also adjust the ambient occlusion, which is going to adjust the highlights for the darks in here. I find the ambient occlusion helpful for getting rid of some of this like plasticky look that you can get with your normals right here. But then once we've done that, I'm going to use material replacer, and I'm going to swap out this material with this material right here. Now notice how it's tiling. That just usually means that we need to take this and we need to make it a little bit bigger. So we're going to bump this up to like 4 feet or something like that. Now it's still tiling a little bit, but overall I think it looks pretty good. So now what we've got is we've got materials in here that are interacting with the light in your 3D space. And so I usually prefer, in any existing models that I have like this, I prefer replacing the glass that they have in there with the new PBR material glass. So I just take the glass material right here, I apply it to a surface, and then I use material replacer in order to swap all of those out like this. But then the other thing you can do with glass is if it's not reflecting the way that you want it to, you can bring the opacity up. And so when you bring the opacity up, what it's going to do is it's going to start reflecting more light in here. And you can kind of see that if I move the environment around a little bit more. So if I adjust this environment right here, notice how this is now reflecting in your materials. And then once you're done with this, you can do an export of images. You can send this to layout. You can do whatever you want. But say you wanted to export this image, you could just do a file export, 2D graphic. But then if you open that image up, it's going to look something like this. So you can use this in order to export your rendered images from SketchUp, or you can send them over to layout as well. Okay, so that's kind of a high-level overview of the new rendering features in SketchUp. If you have any questions about anything I talked about, feel free to leave them down below. So one of the things I'm really interested in, and we may do a separate video on this, is combining the styles with the rendered images. I think that's going to be really cool. But I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. What do you think about the new rendering functionality in SketchUp? I just love having that conversation with you guys. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.